Welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today, we are going to discuss the Hindu newspaper dated 6 January 2019. The news to be discussed has been presented on the screen, and timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Now, I'll be covering this part of today's DNS, and the other part shall be covered by Shubhangi ma'am. With this, let's start our today's discussion. The first news appears on the very first page. It says, in a first, Malia declared a fugitive economic offender. Special court's ruling comes on ED's plea under this Fugitive Economic Offenders Act. So Vijay Malia has become the first person to be declared as a fugitive economic offender under this Fugitive Economic Offenders Act 2018. And he was declared as fugitive economic offender by the special court which was hearing his case. So on the backdrop of this news, this term fugitive economic offender under the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act 2018 becomes extremely important. Now this topic of fugitive economic offender in your prelims forms a part of Indian economy, whereas in your mains it forms a part of GS paper 2 as well as GS paper 3. So in your GS paper 2, this topic gets covered under statutory, regulatory and various quasi-judicial bodies, whereas in your GS paper 3, it gets covered under issues relating to Indian economy, including economic offences. So on this note, let us understand certain basics with respect to this Fugitive Economic Offenders Act 2018 and also the fact that how a person or an individual is declared as a fugitive economic offender. Let's go through this analysis. So before understanding anything, first of all, let us understand this very concept of the fact that who is a fugitive economic offender, which in this discussion we shall refer as FEO, that is fugitive economic offender. So a fugitive economic offender is an individual against whom a warrant has been issued in relation to a scheduled offence. And such warrant is issued against a person who has either left India to avoid criminal prosecution or who being abroad refuses to return to India to face criminal prosecution. So basically, a fugitive economic offender is a person against whom a warrant has been issued in relation to a scheduled offence and who has left India to avoid criminal prosecution or who being abroad refuses to return to India to face criminal prosecution. So far you must be wondering about this scheduled offence. So these scheduled offences are certain acts under which a person can be declared as a fugitive economic offender. These scheduled offences has been provided in the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act itself. Let's go through in brief some of those acts under which a person can be declared as a fugitive economic offender. As you can see, this is the schedule under the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act 2018 and the scheduled offences are primarily under certain offences under the Indian Penal Code, offences under Negotiable Instruments Act 1881, offences under the Reserve Bank of India Act 1934, offences under Central Excise Act 1944, Customs Act 1962, Prohibition of Benami Property Transaction Act. So any person committing any offence under this Prohibition of Benami Property Transaction Act can also be declared as a fugitive economic offender. Further, offences under Prevention of Corruption Act, offences under SEBI Act, offences under Prevention of Money Laundering Act 2002, offences under Limited Liability Partnership Act 2008, offences under Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010. Further, offences under the Companies Act, offences under the Black Money, Undisclosed Foreign Income and Assets and Imposition of Tax Act, under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and also offences under the GST Act. So you see there are a list of statutes or laws under which if a person commits any offence, then he or she may be declared as a fugitive economic offender by the special court. So after understanding about the fugitive economic offender, let us also understand briefly the purpose of this act, as into why this particular act was enacted by the Government of India. It provides for measures to deter fugitive economic offenders from evading the process of law in India by staying outside the jurisdiction of Indian courts and thereby to preserve and maintain the sanctity of Indian law. So this can be said to be primarily the aim and purpose of this Fugitive Economic Offenders Act 2018. So the question is, how is any person declared as a fugitive economic offender? Basically, it involves three processes. First, an application has to be filed in a special court against a person who is considered to be a fugitive economic offender. And such application can be filed by a director or any officer not below the rank of deputy director as authorized by the director. So basically, if a director or a deputy director has reasons to believe that any person fulfills the criteria of fugitive economic offenders as discussed above, then such officer may file an application in a special court to declare such person as a fugitive economic offender. The second step is that after hearing the application, the special court shall issue a notice to an individual who is alleged to be a fugitive economic offender. Third and the last is that if the special court has reason to believe that the person is a fugitive economic offender, then the special court shall issue a notice. And in this notice, it shall mention two things. First, it shall require the individual to appear at a specified place on a specified time. Second, failure of the person to appear on a specified date, place, and time shall result in declaration of such individual as fugitive economic offender. And in the process, the special court shall also order for confiscation of the property of such alleged fugitive economic offender. Further, the special court may also order confiscation of proceeds of crime in India or abroad, and also order for confiscation of any property or benami property in India or abroad owned by the fugitive economic offender. So these are some of the orders which a special court may order with respect to either confiscation of proceeds of crime in India or abroad, or confiscation of property or even benami property either in India or abroad owned by the fugitive economic offender. And the central government shall appoint an administrator to manage such confiscated properties. On this note, let us also understand some of the important powers given to the director appointed under this act. So the director or a deputy director or any officer not below the rank of deputy director shall be authorized and have power with respect of a civil court under the Civil Procedure Code with respect to discovery and inspection, with respect to enforcing attendance of person and also examining them under oath. Further, they shall have power to receive evidence on affidavits. Further, they shall also have power with respect to examining witness documents and also enter the premises for search and seizure. So these shall be some of the powers of director or deputy director or any officer authorized not below the rank of a deputy director under this Fugitive Economic Offenders Act 2018. Now after our discussion, this forms your first practice question for the day. What you can do is to take a pause of 5 seconds. It says the Fugitive Economic Offenders Act 2018 provides for which of the following with respect to a fugitive economic offender. Options are: first, confiscation of benami property. Yes, this is correct. Second, confiscation of proceeds of crime in India or abroad. Yes, this is also correct. Third, administrator to manage confiscated property. Yes, this is also correct, as we have seen that the central government shall appoint an administrator to manage such confiscated property of the fugitive economic offender. So in this, all the three statements are correct. So the correct answer here is D. So we understand that this concept of fugitive economic offenders becomes extremely important and relevant from your upcoming prelims examination. With this, let's move on to our next news analysis. The next news appears on page number 15. It says, demystifying science. What is inhalable mRNA? Now, mRNA refers to messenger ribonucleic acid. So, these messenger ribonucleic acid or mRNA has the potential of inducing the cells to produce therapeutic proteins. However, the greatest problem with respect to this inducement of the cells to produce therapeutic proteins was to find or devise safe and efficient ways to deliver these mRNA to the targeted cells. So it is in this aspect that researchers from MIT in United States have designed certain inhalable form of mRNA which can be used to treat lung diseases. And this mRNA can be administered directly into the lungs through the aerosols. So basically researchers at MIT has found an efficient and suitable way to deliver these mRNA to the targeted cells. And according to the research, these messenger RNA can be given through these aerosols directly to the lungs. Hence, it can also help in treating certain diseases. Thus, this topic of messenger RNA in your prelims examination forms a part of general science. So, in this aspect, after understanding what the researchers at MIT are trying to do, let us also understand certain basics with respect to this RNA as well as DNA, as questions have been asked by UPSC in the year 2016. So, first of all, let us understand about RNA. So, basically, RNA is one of the three major biological macromolecules essential for all known forms of life. Further, deoxyribonucleic acid, that is DNA, is considered as the blueprint of the cell. And the DNA carries all the genetic information required for the cell to grow, to take in nutrients, and also to propagate. And RNA is the DNA photocopy of the cell. So when a cell needs to produce certain amount of protein, then it activates the protein's gene or that portion of DNA that codes for that protein. So suppose this is the DNA, and when the cell needs to produce protein, then it activates that portion of the DNA that codes for the protein. Suppose this part of the DNA codes for such protein. So the cell activates this portion of the DNA that codes for protein. And in the process, it produces the multiple copies of that piece of DNA in the form of messenger RNA or mRNA. So these multiple copies of mRNA, when produced, are then used to translate the genetic code into the protein. So once multiple copies of that piece of DNA in the form of messenger RNA is produced, then these multiple copies of mRNA are then used to translate the genetic code into protein with the help of ribosomes. So to repeat the entire process once to get a better clarity. So as mentioned, RNA was the DNA photocopy of the cell. So when a cell needs to produce protein, then it activates that portion of DNA which is coded for protein. So suppose in this entire DNA, this red portion is coded for protein, then when the cell needs to produce protein, it activates this portion of the DNA to produce protein. And in the process, it produces multiple copies of that piece of DNA in the form of messenger RNA. So these multiple copies are produced in the form of messenger RNA. Further, once multiple copies of messenger RNA is produced, then these multiple copies of messenger RNA are then used to translate the genetic code into protein with the help of ribosomes. Thus, we can say that RNA expands the quantity of a given protein that can be made at one time from a given gene. And it also provides as an important control point for regulating when and how much protein has to be made. On this note, let us understand the differences between DNA as well as RNA. DNA is a double-stranded molecule while RNA is a single-stranded molecule, as you can see in this particular picture. DNA is responsible for storing and transferring genetic information, whereas RNA directly codes for amino acids. And as discussed, this RNA acts as a messenger between DNA and ribosomes in order to make protein. Another difference is between the pairings of DNA and RNA. DNA uses the bases of cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine, whereas RNA uses cytosine, guanine, adenine, and uracil. So basically, uracil differs from thymine in the fact that it lacks a methyl group on its ring. So these can be said to be some of the differences between DNA and RNA, as DNA is used to store and transfer genetic information, whereas RNA codes for amino acids and also acts as a messenger between DNA and ribosomes in order to make protein. Further, DNA is a double-stranded molecule, whereas RNA is a single-stranded molecule. And DNA uses the bases of cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine, whereas RNA uses cytosine, guanine, adenine, and uracil. And uracil differs from thymine in the fact that it lacks a methyl group on its ring. So these can be said to be some of the important highlights of DNA as well as RNA. So after the discussion, these forms your practice questions number 2 and practice question number 3. This particular question was asked in the year 2016. What you can do is to take a pause of 5 seconds. So this question says, consider the following statements about RNA. First, the nitrogenous bases in RNA are adenine, guanine, cytosine and uracil. Yes, this is correct as we have just seen. Second, RNA is a double-stranded molecule whereas DNA is a single-stranded molecule. No, this statement is incorrect and it's just the reverse. As you can see, RNA is a single-stranded molecule and DNA is a double-stranded molecule. So the second statement is incorrect. So in this, A is our correct answer, that is 1 only. Now coming to this question of UPSC, it says, in the context of developments in bioinformatics, the term transcriptome, sometimes seen in the news, refers to. In this, the correct answer was B, that is full range of mRNA molecules expressed by an organism. So we see a question on mRNA has already been asked by UPSC in 2016. Hence, this topic of mRNA and its basic functioning becomes extremely important for us to understand. So in this news, this information on mRNA becomes extremely important. And also this research conducted by researchers at MIT has great potentials where mRNA can be given through aerosols directly to the lungs or to the targeted cells. Thus, this becomes a very important topic. With this, let's move on to our next news analysis. The next news appears on page number 7 in section 2 of the Hindu newspaper. It says, TEXPROCIL seeks interest subvention from government for cotton yarn. It is the only product not given benefit under the foreign trade policy. Now, in this news, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs has recently given its approval to include merchant exporters under the interest equalization scheme for pre and post shipment rupee export credit. So earlier, these benefits under interest equalization scheme was available only to the manufacturers. However, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs has allowed extension of these benefits to merchant exporters. So given this backdrop, this news highlights that the Cotton Textile Export Promotion Council has urged the government to include cotton yarn under the interest equalization scheme as well. This topic in your prelims examination forms part of Indian economy. Presently, the benefit under this interest equalization scheme is available for all types of fabrics and apparel. However, so far, cotton yarn has been excluded. So on this note, let us understand some of the important features of interest equalization scheme. This scheme was approved by the government to be implemented from 1st April 2015 for 5 years. The scheme aims to boost exports from India by providing interest subsidy on the loans taken by MSMEs, manufacturing exporters, as well as merchant exporters for the export of certain notified products. Under the scheme, the rate of interest of equalization would be 5% for MSMEs and 3% for manufacturing as well as merchant exporters. So in layman terms, to understand this interest subsidy, let's take an example. Suppose if the interest rate on MSMEs is 12%, then in such case 5% shall be paid by the government and this MSME sector has to pay only 7%, that is remaining 7%. Similarly, suppose for example, if in the manufacturing and merchant exporters, suppose if their rate of interest is 10% and interest equalization rate is 3%, then the government will pay the 3% and these manufacturing and merchant exporters will pay the remaining 7%. So the products which receive the interest subsidy on exports are largely in labor intensive sectors such as agriculture, textiles, leather, handicrafts, machinery, etc. Thus, this interest subsidy on exports provided by the government also helps in job creation. So, after understanding the scheme, the important point to note is that how will this inclusion of merchant exporters under this interest equalization scheme help or is expected to boost exports? As we know that the textile industry is dominated by the MSMEs and these MSMEs in turn depend upon these merchant exporters for the export of their products. As these merchant exporters account for roughly 35 to 40% of textile imports from India. Hence, in this regard, the inclusion of merchant exporters under the interest equalization scheme is expected to boost exports, as most of these MSMEs depend solely on these merchant exporters for the export of their products. So, in this aspect, this particular article becomes extremely important, and also it becomes important to know about this interest equalization scheme, as questions may be framed in the upcoming UPSC examination. So, after understanding about this interest equalization scheme, let us also learn certain basic facts with respect to Cotton Textiles Export Promotion Council. As you can see, the TEXPROCIL or Cotton Textiles Export Promotion Council is sponsored by the Government of India, and it was established in the year 1954 as an autonomous non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of exports. It says that the TEXPROCIL has been the international face of cotton textiles from India, which facilitates exports worldwide. It mentions that its members are well established manufacturers and exporters of cotton textile products like cotton, yarns, fabrics, home textiles. So basically, the council promotes exports of raw cotton, cotton yarns and blended yarns, woven and knitted fabrics, home textiles, as well as technical textiles. So this becomes some of the important information with respect to TEXPROCIL or Cotton Textiles Export Promotion Council. After going through the discussion, this forms your fourth practice question for the day. What you can do is to take a pause of 5 seconds. It says, consider the following statements about interest equalization scheme. First, it aims to boost exports from India by providing interest subsidy on loans. Yes, this statement is correct as we have already seen. Second, the rate of interest equalization is same for MSMEs and manufacturing exporters under this IES, that is interest equalization scheme. As you can see, the interest equalization rate provided under the scheme is 5% for MSME and 3% for manufacturing and merchant exporters. Hence, they are not same and they are different rate of interest. Hence, the second statement is incorrect. Third, Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs has approved the inclusion of merchant exporters under interest equalization scheme. In this news, we started with this discussion where it said that Cabinet has allowed inclusion of merchant exporters under the interest equalization scheme. Hence, the statement is also correct. Hence, in this question, A is the correct answer. That is, 1 and 3 statements are correct. With this, let's move on to our next news analysis. The next news appears on page number 14 in section 1. It says, detecting ultra low levels of mercury in water. The sensor has high sensitivity and selectivity. Now, a team of researchers from India have found an innovative way to develop a sensor that operates using this surface enhanced Raman spectroscopy, as it has high sensitivity and far better methods with respect to detecting mercury in water. Mercury levels in water needs to be checked carefully as it is a toxic substance and contaminates the entire food chain. Now, this topic in your prelims examination forms a part of general science as well as general issues of environment, ecology, as well as biodiversity. In this analysis, let us understand about mercury and how mercury poisoning is toxic for human health. Now, mercury is a naturally occurring heavy metal found in air, water, as well as soil. Mercury occurs naturally in the Earth's crust. Mercury is released in the environment through volcanic activity. Studies have shown that industrial effluents as well as industrial discharge have higher mercury levels than that allowed by the World Health Organization as well as Indian guidelines. Further, mercury is also one of the world's most toxic metals, and according to World Health Organization, it is one of the top 10 threats to public health. Let us go through some of the sources of mercury contamination. So, some of the sources of mercury generation or contamination can be, so mercury is contained in many products including batteries, measuring devices such as thermometers and barometers, electric switches and relays and equipments, lamps, dental amalgam, skin lightening products and other cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, as well as in the power generation industry. Now, many use mercury to separate pure metal of gold from the silt, that is, from where this gold is extracted. So, the mercury discharged as industrial effluent or waste results in these mercury going into the sea or river, thereby polluting the sea as well as river. From those sea or river, it goes to the fish, and from the fish, it comes back to the human as humans end up consuming such fish which is laden with mercury. It says that the most common form of exposure to mercury is by eating fish containing methyl mercury. Now, this methyl mercury is an organic form of the chemical which forms when bacteria react with mercury in water, soil, or plants. So, this methyl mercury forms when bacteria reacts with mercury in water, soil, or plants. Now, methyl mercury also results in bioaccumulation. So, bioaccumulation occurs when an organism contains higher concentration of the substance as compared to its surrounding. For example, fish. Now, fish in such polluted water bioaccumulates mercury. It further mentions that this methyl mercury also biomagnifies. For example, large predatory fish are more likely to have high levels of mercury because they eat various smaller fish as well as plankton which has high level of mercury contamination. Thus, because of mercury pollution, it results in bioaccumulation as well as biomagnification. Further, let us also go through some of the impact of mercury contamination in water. It says that the mercury contamination may have certain toxic effects on nervous system, digestive system, as well as the immune system of a human body, as well as on our lungs, kidneys, skins, as well as eyes. So we understand that mercury is extremely toxic for human body. Further, fetuses are also more susceptible to developmental effects due to mercury. So, if a pregnant woman consumes certain mercury contaminated food products, then it may also harm the fetus, as the methyl mercury can adversely impact baby's growing brain as well as the nervous system. So, basically, mercury impacts nervous system of a fetus, and hence mercury poisoning is extremely dangerous for a growing fetus. Thus, mercury contamination in a human body basically impairs neurological development as it impacts cognitive thinking, memory, attention, language, as well as motor and visual spatial skills. And as already mentioned, that mercury contamination also impacts the growing fetus. It says that the inorganic salts of mercury are corrosive to skin, eyes, and gastrointestinal tract and may also induce kidney toxicity if ingested. So, overall, mercury is highly or extremely toxic for human health. Now, Minamata disease is a neurological syndrome caused by severe mercury poisoning, and these symptoms were first discovered in the Minamata city in Japan in the year 1956, as it was noticed that it was caused by release of methyl mercury in the industrial wastewater from the chemical factory, which continued from 1932 to 1968. Hence, so Minamata disease is associated with mercury poisoning. So, what can be the possible ways to reduce human exposure to mercury sources or mercury contamination? First of all, we must promote the use of clean energy. Then, we must eliminate the use of mercury in gold extraction and also the use of mercury in other industrial processes. Then, we must phase out non essential use of mercury containing products and implement its safe handling, use, and disposal of remaining mercury containing products. Further, in 2013, governments agreed to the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Now, this is very important from your prelims perspective. It says that the convention obliges government parties to take a range of actions, including addressing mercury emissions to air and also phasing out certain mercury containing products. So, on this note, let us go through some of the important highlights of this Minamata Convention on Mercury. It basically mentions to ban new mercury mines, phase out existing mercury mines, phase out and slowly phase down use of mercury in number of products as well as processes, control measures on emissions of mercury in air and also release of mercury to land as well as water. Further, regulation of the informal sector on the use of mercury and also the use of mercury in small scale gold mining. Further, the convention also addresses interim storage of mercury and its disposal once it becomes a waste. So basically, storage as well as disposal of waste mercury becomes one of the major concern with respect to mercury pollution. So the Article 1 of Minamata Convention on Mercury states that the objective of this convention is to protect the human health and the environment from anthropogenic emissions and releases of mercury and mercury compounds. So this again becomes extremely important to understand from our examination perspective about this Minamata Convention on Mercury. Now, anthropogenic emissions refers to such emissions caused by human activities, including greenhouse gas emissions as well as emissions of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, after going through the discussion, this forms your fifth practice question for the day. What you can do is to take a pause of 5 seconds. The question is, which of the following statements are correct about mercury poisoning? First, fetuses are least susceptible to any effects due to mercury poisoning. No, the statement is incorrect, as we have seen that fetuses are most susceptible to developmental effects due to mercury poisoning, and it also impacts their nervous system. Second, methyl mercury bioaccumulates in fish and shellfish. Yes, this is correct. Third, Minamata disease is a neurological syndrome caused by severe mercury poisoning. Yes, this is also correct. Hence, in this particular question, C is the right answer, that is 2 and 3 only. So, we understand that this topic becomes extremely important with respect to mercury poisoning. With this, let's move on to our next news analysis. The next news appears on page number 7 in section 2 of the Hindu newspaper. It says, $10 rise in crude impacts inflation by 49 to 58 basis points. It says that the price rise hits current account deficit and a higher GDP growth won't help it, as per a RBI study. So basically, a group of researchers at RBI has conducted this study titled The Impact of Crude Price Shock on India's Current Account Deficit, Inflation and Fiscal Deficit. So basically, the highlight of this report is that India is one of the largest oil importing countries in the world. And crude oil forms an important basket of its imports, as 80% of our domestic requirements is met through the import of crude oil. So the report highlights that any crude price shock or a sudden increase in crude price will have a significant impact on the macroeconomic stability of India, including an impact on current account deficit, inflation, as well as fiscal deficit. So the report mentions that a sudden increase in crude oil price will impact the macroeconomic stability of the country, including an impact on current account deficit, inflation, as well as fiscal deficit. Let's see how it impacts these three things differently. Now, an increase in crude oil price would lead to higher imports, and this will lead to widening of the trade deficit, which will ultimately lead to a higher current account deficit. So, an increase in price of crude oil results in higher imports, which further results in increasing the trade deficit, and this overall widens or increases the current account deficit. Now, an increase in crude oil price also leads to higher inflation, as oil is a critical input in the economy since it is used in number of sectors such as transportation, electricity, industries, etc. Hence, an increase in crude oil price leads to increase in rate of inflation. Further, oil is also a constituent of consumer price index. So a higher crude oil price results to a higher inflation in the economy. Now, in case of a sudden increase in crude oil price, the government will have to intervene to protect domestic consumers from such sudden price rise. And this intervention will be in the form of subsidy provided by the government. And this subsidy provided by the government will further lead to an increase in government borrowing. And this overall will result in an increase of fiscal deficit. So the report highlights that every $10 rise per barrel of crude oil will result in an additional $12.5 billion of deficit. 0.01 can be said to be 1 basis point. So as per the report, it mentions that for every $10 rise per barrel of crude oil will have an impact on current account deficit at 43 basis point. Inflation will be impacted at 49 basis point, and fiscal deficit will be impacted at 43 basis point. So as per the report of RBI, a sudden impact of crude price shock will have an impact on current account deficit, inflation, as well as fiscal deficit in the Indian economy. Hence, this topic becomes extremely important to understand from our examination perspective. With this, we come to an end to discussion of today's newspaper. Let's move on to the question for the day.